Sunlight streamed through the crystal windows of a mansion perched high above the city, bathing the marble foyer in golden hues and casting brilliant reflections across the chandeliers. It was a morning like countless others in the world of millionaire Alejandro Moreira, a man who had inherited not only immeasurable wealth but also a life marked by profound loneliness. The towering walls, adorned with paintings by legendary artists, reflected a grandeur that deep down failed to fill the emptiness in his heart. Among Persian rugs and imposing columns, he moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had possessed everything, except the one thing he truly yearned for: a complete family, authentic love, someone who wouldn't measure his worth in figures or material possessions, but in humanity itself. Alejandro had lost his wife years earlier in an accident that stripped away his hope for complete happiness in mere seconds. Since then, his life had been reduced to raising his young son Gabriel alone, a boy with bright eyes and an innocent smile, whose only dream was to have a mother who would embrace him at night and tell him stories before sleep. Gabriel, in his childlike purity, prayed to God each evening for a woman who would not only care for him, but also restore joy to his father's weary eyes. The contradiction was brutal. While Alejandro's bank accounts held sums that could sustain entire generations, the intimacy of his home breathed an air of melancholy. Banquets were served on endless tables, yet he and his son ate in silence, as if each piece of fine china reminded them of what was no longer there. Luxury had become a cruel mirror, reflecting the poverty of his soul. It was then, amid whispered conversations with the absent reflection of his wife, that Alejandro made an extraordinary decision. He would disguise himself as a poor man. He would renounce, at least temporarily, his custom-tailored suits, Swiss watches, and collector automobiles, to descend into the simple world where wealth doesn't mask intentions or purchase feelings. He would do it for his son, but also for himself, because deep down, he knew that no love born from the warmth of his fortune would be genuine. Gabriel watched him with that mixture of innocence and hope that only children possess. That day, sitting on the bed with a wooden toy in his hand, he heard his father make a promise that would be etched in his heart forever. "My son, I swear to you that I will find a woman who will love us not for what we have, but for who we are. A woman who can look into your eyes and see you as the miracle you are, and who can look at me without seeing a millionaire, but a man who still knows how to love." It was a promise born from desperation, but also from faith. A promise that would open an unexpected path, filled with trials, encounters, and revelations. Because in the humblest corners of life, where hands become dusty and hearts are forged in adversity, Alejandro was about to discover what money could never buy. And there, amid the vastness of his doubts, appeared a figure no one would have imagined. A black woman, a cleaning lady with a firm gaze and hands worn by years of work, who would cross his path as an answer to a child's prayer and the secret desire of a man tired of masks and appearances. It wouldn't be easy. Society would judge, disbelief would raise walls, and even Alejandro himself would doubt the decision he had made. But that woman would bring with her something that neither millions nor mansions could provide: dignity, kindness, and unshakable faith. Stay until the end, because you'll discover how a simple cleaning lady forever changed the destiny of a millionaire and his son. Subscribe now and hit the bell to not miss these stories that transform lives. The city awakened each morning to the roar of luxury automobiles cruising wide, luminous avenues, the murmur of exclusive cafes where suited men discussed million-dollar contracts, and the distant echo of helicopters landing on private terraces. Alejandro Moreira was one of the names that dominated this landscape of power and abundance. His face appeared in financial magazines as an example of success. His signature opened doors in any corner of the world, and his investments were discussed with respect in the corridors of international banks. He was a man who, in everyone's eyes, had absolutely everything. However, the real story began when those lights dimmed and cameras stopped focusing on him. Behind the high walls of his mansion, Alejandro became a widower marked by an impossible-to-fill absence. The image of his wife, Isabella, haunted him in every corner of the house. On the piano rested the sheet music she used to play on rainy afternoons, when melodies mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. In the bedroom hung a red dress he never allowed to be stored away, as if keeping it there could stop time and retain the perfume of the one who had been the love of his life. The tragedy occurred during a brief trip, one of those outings that seem harmless. Isabella had taken a car to the hospital where she volunteered, and at an unexpected intersection, fate tore her from Alejandro's world. It was a quick, brutal accident, an instant when the universe seemed to decide he must face his days alone. The news arrived like thunder. His wife had departed and would never return. That day, the millionaire who knew how to negotiate million-dollar figures collapsed like a helpless child. For weeks, the silent palace transformed into a mausoleum of memories. Curtains remained closed, meals went untouched, and the echo of Alejandro's footsteps seemed to bounce in an endless abyss. Gabriel, barely a child, didn't understand why his mother wasn't returning. He asked again and again if she would come back, and Alejandro, with reddened eyes, held him tight, seeking in those small arms the strength he could no longer find within himself. Money, which had been a symbol of power, became an unbearable burden. Banquets organized by his associates suffocated him. Receptions filled with false smiles produced an even deeper void, and every applause received for his business achievements sounded like cruel mockery amid his solitude. The millionaire began to question what sense it made to possess all that if the essential, the only thing he truly desired, had slipped through his fingers. Months passed. In time, Alejandro resumed his public life, returned to directing his companies, reappeared in newspapers, and reclaimed his place on boards of directors. But deep down, he was no longer the same. His gaze had hardened, his smile became scarce, and above all, his heart closed to any attempt at female companionship. To the world, he was the most coveted bachelor, the man who could choose with whom to share his days. To him, there was simply no one who could occupy Isabella's place. Until Gabriel, with the innocence that only children possess, began insisting on something that pierced the millionaire's very core. One night, as Alejandro tucked him in, the boy whispered, "Daddy, when will a mommy come for me?" That question became a thorn in his conscience. It wasn't just a child's desire for a maternal figure. It was the cry of a heart-seeking love, companionship, tenderness. Alejandro felt guilty for not having thought earlier about such a vital need. The boy deserved to laugh more, deserved someone to embrace him with a mother's sweetness, someone to tell him stories before sleep and defend him from nighttime fears. This is how the most outrageous idea of all was born in Alejandro's mind. He looked at himself in the mirror one dawn with a tired face and sunken eyes, and understood he would never find a sincere woman if he continued surrounded by riches. Most saw him as a walking bank, not as a man with scars on his soul. Then he decided the unthinkable. He would shed everything, disguise himself as someone ordinary, and launch himself into the world without his titles or luxuries, to see if there, in simplicity, he could find the true love he so yearned for his son. It was a silent but firm resolution. He packed away his silk suits, exclusive watches, and collector jewelry in boxes. He sold, through intermediaries, some automobiles that were the pride of his neighbors, and moved with Gabriel to a small apartment on the city's outskirts, where no one would recognize him. There began his new life. Simple clothes, public transportation, frugal meals. And although at first it felt uncomfortable, he soon discovered there was something liberating about walking without bodyguards, waiting for the bus alongside ordinary workers, sharing freshly baked bread at the small table of a kitchen lit only by a cheap lamp. Gabriel, seeing him laugh again in those small experiences, understood his father was doing it for him, and this filled him with gratitude. The millionaire, disguised as a poor man, had taken the first step toward an unexpected destiny, a path where faith, humility, and hope would begin weaving the fabric of a miracle. The first weeks in the modest apartment were an earthquake for Alejandro. He was accustomed to waking to the distant murmur of ornamental fountains and the aroma of breakfasts prepared by an army of cooks. Now the sound that roused him was the screech of an old fan, and the smell of simple coffee he brewed himself in a small aluminum pot. Initially, every detail seemed a cruel reminder of everything he had left behind, but gradually he began to discover that in that simplicity lay unexpected beauty. Gabriel, with his curious gaze, adapted faster than him. The child found entertainment in things Alejandro could never have imagined. In the wooden carts that neighborhood children pushed down the street, in impromptu soccer games on hot asphalt, in rainy afternoons where puddles became miniature oceans for his paper boats. Alejandro watched him in silence and understood this was the true wealth he had been seeking, the ability to enjoy the small, the genuine, what cannot be bought. To avoid suspicion, Alejandro adopted a completely different appearance. He put away his carefully styled hair and let it grow a bit, tousled by the wind. He exchanged his tailored suits for simple shirts, worn pants, and leather shoes already defeated by time. Instead of his Swiss watches, he wore on his wrist a thread bracelet Gabriel had made at school. It was a disguise, yes, but also a mask that began to free him from the invisible chains of his status. Life in the neighborhood wasn't easy. Bills were paid with effort, neighbors knew each other, and privacy was a non-existent luxury. Alejandro found himself for the first time standing in line at a grocery store, holding coins in his hand and calculating whether he had enough for rice, bread, and a little milk. That sensation of vulnerability shook him, but also taught him to look with respect at those who, without millions in the bank, carried their families forward with dignity. Gabriel learned alongside him. Each day, Alejandro sought to transmit a lesson. One afternoon, while sharing a simple dinner of soup and stale bread, the boy asked, "Daddy, why don't we buy more food like before?" Alejandro looked at him tenderly and responded calmly, "Because true abundance isn't in quantity, son, but in knowing how to be grateful for what we have. When we learn to value little, we're ready to receive much." Those words were engraved in the child's heart like seeds. Every moment transformed into a lesson about humility, the respectful greeting to the elderly man who sold fruit on the corner, the grateful smile to the woman who gave them leftover bread at the end of the day, patience on the crowded bus where strangers pressed together like one family. Alejandro began to notice how Gabriel developed a different brightness in his eyes, a brightness that didn't come from expensive toys, but from lived experiences. The boy no longer asked to go to luxury shopping centers, but enjoyed running in the rain or sharing cheap candy with neighborhood friends. The disguised millionaire realized he was fulfilling the promise he had made, teaching him that life's value isn't measured in bank accounts, but in moments of love and gratitude. But the change wasn't only in the child. Alejandro himself transformed each day. The man who once couldn't conceive life without a private driver now found strange peace in walking long blocks with his son's hand in his. He discovered that tiredness after a day of simple work had a different taste, that of honesty, of feeling part of something greater than himself. At night, Before sleep, they would light a small candle instead of electric lights, as if it were a ritual. There, in the twilight, Alejandro would take Gabriel's hand and they would pray together. The child always asked for the same thing: "Lord, send me a good mommy who will love me." Every time he heard that plea, Alejandro felt his heart break a little more. It was the innocent voice of a son, claiming from heaven what he, with all his money, hadn't been able to buy. And in those moments, he understood that his decision to disguise himself as poor wasn't madness, but a divine path to discover that woman who, someday, would arrive. The disguise protected him from interested looks, but also pushed him toward the unexpected. In the coming days, without imagining it, life would place before him a woman who didn't fit the molds of high society, but who had something infinitely more valuable: unbreakable dignity and faith that would illuminate the darkness of his soul. The routine in that humble neighborhood flowed with the simplicity of the everyday. Street vendors traversed the streets with their calls, children played barefoot amid laughter and dust, and housewives greeted each other from windows with voices that smelled of freshly brewed coffee. Alejandro, still adapting to his new life, had begun working simple jobs to maintain the appearance of an ordinary man. He washed cars at a small station, loaded boxes in a warehouse, and returned each afternoon with a tired face, but with the satisfaction of having earned the day's bread with his own hands. It was on one of those days, when afternoon was slowly falling, painting the sky orange, that Gabriel broke free from his hand to run after a ball rolling toward the street. A car appeared suddenly, advancing without slowing down, and in that instant, Alejandro's heart froze. Before he could react, a woman shot out from the opposite sidewalk. She had dark skin, hair tied back with a simple scarf, and her hands, roughened by years of work, stretched forcefully to grab the child and pull him away just in time. The shouts of passers-by filled the air. The car disappeared in the distance, indifferent to the danger it had caused, but the scene remained etched in everyone's memory. Alejandro ran desperately toward his son and found him trembling in that woman's arms. She held him tenderly, stroking his head while whispering reassuring words. Gabriel, still frightened, clung to her as if he had known her all his life. "Thank you," Alejandro stammered with a broken voice, feeling the weight of what he could have lost. The woman looked at him calmly, without pride or vanity, only with the serenity of one who knows she has done right. "A child always deserves protection, sir," she responded softly. "It doesn't matter whose he is." It was then that Alejandro observed her more closely. She wore a simple cleaning uniform, one of those that usually go unnoticed in the crowd. Her shoes were worn, her hands full of small scars, yet there was in her bearing a dignity that disarmed him. She wasn't the figure that high society parties would have considered worthy of admiration, but in that moment she radiated more grandeur than any of the women Alejandro had known in his world of luxury. "My name is Clara," she said, noticing Alejandro's intense gaze. "I work at the school on the corner and sometimes in neighborhood houses." Alejandro nodded, still moved, while Gabriel continued clinging to her. The child, with eyes still moist, murmured, "Daddy, she saved me." And then, with that naturalness children possess for saying what they feel, he added, "I want her to be my friend." Those words fell like a seed in Alejandro's heart. Something about Clara, in her spontaneous gesture and voice charged with humanity, made him think that perhaps heaven had begun to answer Gabriel's prayer. In the following days, Clara became a recurring presence. Sometimes they coincided at the grocery store, others at the bus stop, and always there was in her a kind gesture, a sincere smile, simple advice. She never accepted anything in return, and when Alejandro tried to thank her with more than due, she responded firmly, "I don't need favors. I just do what anyone would do." However, not anyone did. Alejandro knew this. In a world where many looked the other way, she had risked her life for a child she didn't even know. That spoke of a character forged in adversity, of faith that wasn't proclaimed with words, but with actions. Gabriel, for his part, began seeking her out. He brought her drawings made at school, told her stories of invented games, and listened fascinated when she recounted anecdotes from her childhood in a distant town where poverty coexisted with hope. Clara had no children, but treated the boy with natural tenderness, as if in her heart there had always existed a place reserved for him. Alejandro observed these scenes with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. He had never seen his son smile with such fullness since Isabella's death. There was something in Clara that healed invisible wounds, that filled silences with a warmth that couldn't be explained. And the most surprising thing was that all this happened without asking for anything, without pretending anything, simply by being herself. One afternoon, while sharing a bench in the neighborhood plaza, Alejandro asked her, "How is it that you always have so much peace, even amid so many difficulties?" Clara looked at him with deep eyes and responded serenely, "Peace doesn't come from what we have, but from whom we trust. I trust in God, and that's enough for me." Her words resonated in Alejandro like an echo that stripped him bare inside. He had read business books, heard conferences about success, but no one had ever spoken to him with such certainty and simplicity about the secret of peace. It was then he understood that the encounter with Clara hadn't been chance, but the beginning of something that would test everything he believed about love, dignity, and the true value of life. Time passed, and Clara became an inevitable part of Alejandro and Gabriel's daily life. At first, she was merely an occasional presence, a woman who appeared with her blue uniform and working hands at the most unexpected moments. But gradually, her figure transformed into something more, a refuge for the child, a mystery for the father, a seed of hope germinating in silence. The first signs of her true character came in simple situations. One morning, when Alejandro was dropping Gabriel off at school, he heard other children mocking the little one for his worn shoes. The move to the humble neighborhood had forced him to dress in simple clothes, and although he tried not to give it importance, the comments hurt him. Gabriel lowered his head, trying to ignore the laughter, until Clara appeared in the courtyard with a broom in her hand. "What are you laughing at?" she asked firmly, looking directly at the children. Her voice wasn't angry, but had serene authority. The little ones fell silent instantly. Clara knelt in front of Gabriel, gently lifted his chin, and said clearly for everyone to hear, "Never be ashamed of what you wear, son. What matters isn't the shoes, but the path you choose to walk in them." The words, simple and firm, fell like a weight on the atmosphere. Alejandro, observing from a distance, felt a lump in his throat. That woman not only defended his son, but planted life lessons in him that he himself, with all his education and money, had never known how to express that way. Another day, at the neighborhood market, a vendor tried to cheat Gabriel by giving him less fruit than they had paid for. Alejandro was about to intervene when he saw Clara, who had arrived to do her shopping, take the bag and return it to the woman. "Honesty is the foundation of every blessing," she said calmly. "If you try to keep what isn't yours, you'll never know true prosperity." The vendor, ashamed, corrected the error and returned what was missing. Alejandro couldn't help but smile. Clara had defended the child, but had done so without violence or humiliation, with the authority that comes from truth. Clara's faith also manifested in the most intimate moments. One stormy afternoon, when lightning shook the sky, Gabriel hid fearfully under the dining room table. Alejandro tried to calm him, but it was Clara who knelt beside him and began to pray quietly, with words full of tenderness and conviction. "Lord, protect him from all fear. Show him there's no storm greater than your love," she whispered, while caressing the child's hair. Gabriel, little by little, came out of his hiding place and embraced her with the confidence of one who knows he's safe. Alejandro watched them and felt his own heart tremble. There was something in that simple faith, in that complete trust in God, that confronted him with his own lack of hope. Clara's character tests soon came in harder situations too. One afternoon, while returning from school, a group of neighborhood men began murmuring derogatory comments. They weren't mocking the child, but her. "Look who thinks she's a lady now, the cleaning lady walking around with the new widower," one said sarcastically. Alejandro felt his blood boil and was about to confront them, but Clara stopped him with a firm look. She walked slowly toward the men, observed them without rancor, and said with a calm but strong voice, "You can say whatever you want about me. I know who I am before God, and that's enough for me." The silence that followed was so forceful that none dared reply. She took Gabriel's hand and continued walking with her head high, while Alejandro, in silence, understood that true greatness isn't measured in fortunes or titles, but in the capacity to remain firm against injustice without losing dignity. That night, Gabriel asked him as he settled into bed, "Daddy, why do people speak badly of Clara if she's good?" Alejandro didn't know what to answer. He only caressed his forehead and murmured, "Because sometimes people can't bear the light that others carry in their hearts." And as he said those words, he understood that Clara wasn't just the woman who had saved his son, nor the employee who appeared occasionally in their days. She was a living example of values that seemed extinct in a world corrupted by appearance and self-interest. She was a woman who knew how to defend without attacking, teach without imposing, and love without conditions. Each test revealed a bit more of her essence. And in Alejandro's heart grew a certainty that scared and excited him at the same time. Perhaps Clara was the answer to the promise he had made that dawn in front of the mirror when he swore to his son to find a mother who would love him for what he was and not for what he had. The bond between Clara, Gabriel, and Alejandro began to grow like a seed that finds fertile soil, and without anyone noticing, became a tree offering shade and refuge amid life's storms. What at first were chance encounters transformed into custom, and what was custom became necessity. Gabriel could no longer imagine a day without seeking Clara with his gaze, and Alejandro, though trying to maintain distance, knew in the depths of his being that this woman was gradually changing the course of his story. The afternoons in the small neighborhood plaza were an example of this transformation. Clara used to bring a basket of bread she bought at the local bakery, and Gabriel ran to meet her as if it were treasure. They sat on a wooden bench, shared pieces of warm bread, and talked like a family. Alejandro, always observing cautiously, found in those scenes a peace he hadn't felt in years. An improvised table in the open air, a child's laughter, simple words that had more value than any business speech. There was one particular night that remained etched in all three's memory. The electricity went out in the neighborhood, and silence filled with candles lit in house windows. Alejandro invited Clara to dinner in his apartment, not with banquets or luxury tableware, but with a simple stew he had prepared following his mother's recipe. The table was small, the plates were cheap earthenware, but the atmosphere had a warmth that not even his mansion's banquets could equal. Gabriel, excited, took Clara's hand and said, "Today, it really feels like I have a mommy." The comment, so innocent, left Alejandro speechless. Clara, instead of feeling uncomfortable, smiled sweetly and kissed the child's forehead. "Being a mother doesn't always mean giving birth, Gabriel. Sometimes it means giving love, and that can be done at any moment," she whispered. That phrase resonated in Alejandro like an echo that shook his foundations. He realized life was showing him something he had searched for in vain in high society circles: authenticity, Clara didn't pretend, didn't calculate, didn't aspire to anything other than giving the best of herself. Shared prayers also became part of their routine. Each night before sleep, Gabriel insisted that Clara pray with them. They gathered around the small dining room table, holding hands, and she pronounced simple but faith-filled words. "Thank you, Lord, for today's bread, for the roof that covers us, and for the company that sustains us. Teach us to see your love in the small things and to trust in your purpose in everything." Alejandro, who once saw faith as useless ornament, began finding unexpected comfort in those prayers. They weren't sermons or empty speeches, but sincere dialogues that gave meaning to daily life. And most impactful was seeing how Gabriel slept peacefully after each prayer, as if heaven itself rocked him. Shared stories were another bridge that united them. Clara used to recount passages from her childhood in a humble interior town. She spoke of rainy days when she played barefoot under the water, nights when her grandmother told her stories by oil lamplight, improvised music with cans and bottles that turned any gathering into a party. Gabriel listened fascinated, and Alejandro, in silence, discovered a world foreign to him, but that moved him profoundly. On one of those nights, Clara told them a story that marked a before and after. "My grandmother used to tell me that true wealth isn't measured in coins, but in the hands that intertwine to support each other when life gets tough. She died poor in the world's eyes, but rich in love and faith, and I learned there's no greater inheritance than that." Alejandro looked at her in silence, knowing those words were like mirrors showing him how wrong he had been to measure his life only in figures. The bond grew, but with it also grew Alejandro's fear. His secret haunted him at night. What would happen when Clara discovered that this simple man was nothing more than a disguised millionaire? Would she accuse him of deceit, walk away with a broken heart, judge him as a fraud? This dilemma tormented him, but instead of confessing, he chose to remain silent. Meanwhile, Gabriel seemed to flourish. His laughter was more frequent, his eyes shone with renewed joy, and his heart found in Clara the maternal embrace he had asked for so much in prayer. Alejandro, even with all his doubts, knew he was witnessing a miracle, the slow but sure reconstruction of his family. What he didn't imagine was that very soon the truth would come to light and test everything they had built. The secret Alejandro had guarded so carefully began to become an unbearable burden. Each smile from Clara, each gesture of tenderness toward Gabriel, each prayer shared at that modest table made him feel more guilty. She saw him as a simple man, a fighter, worthy of respect, when in reality behind those worn shirts and old shoes hid a millionaire who had lived surrounded by luxuries. Nights became insomnia. Alejandro would rise in silence, watch his son sleep, and wonder how much longer he could sustain that farce. He knew that sooner or later the truth would come to light, and the mere thought of losing Clara's trust tore him apart. However, he clung to the idea that it wasn't yet time, that he needed more time to prove his feelings were genuine. The revelation came unexpectedly, like lightning splitting a clear sky. One morning, Clara left early from the school where she worked and headed to downtown to run errands. There, among streets crowded with traffic and luminous advertisements, she stopped in front of a bookstore window. Her eyes fixed on a financial magazine showing Alejandro Morera's face on the cover, impeccably dressed in a perfectly cut suit, shaking hands with a foreign magnate. Clara's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She took the magazine with trembling hands and read every word. The visionary millionaire transforming the market. The photograph was unmistakable. It was him, the man who each afternoon sat in the plaza with simple clothes, the father who cooked humble stews and traveled by bus. It was him, but in another version, a version she had never imagined. She felt a blow to her chest, as if all air escaped her at once. The magazine fell from her hands and, without thinking, she began walking quickly, trying to arrange the puzzle pieces. The echo of the lie rumbled in her mind. What else had he hidden from her? Was all that closeness just a cruel game by a bored millionaire? That afternoon, when Alejandro returned home, he found Clara waiting at the door. There was no sweetness in her gaze, but a mixture of disappointment and pain that pierced him like a dagger. Gabriel, oblivious to the tension, ran toward her joyfully, but Clara couldn't smile at him as always. "I need to talk to you," she said, with a firm voice that admitted no evasions. Inside the small apartment, Clara held the magazine in her hands and threw it on the table. Alejandro's image on the cover betrayed him without escape. "Who are you really?" she asked, with tears contained in her eyes. "The simple man with whom we share prayers and meals, or the millionaire on the cover who plays at disguising himself as poor?" Alejandro tried to speak, but words drowned in his throat. Finally, with a somber face, he confessed, "I'm both things, Clara. I was the millionaire you see in that magazine, surrounded by luxuries that never filled my emptiness. But I'm also the man you met here, the one who discovered in you and my son the truth of life." Tears rolled down Clara's face. "Why did you lie to me? Why did you make me believe you were someone else? Did you think I didn't deserve the truth?" "No," Alejandro responded desperately. "I thought if you knew who I really was, you could never love me for what I am, but for what I have. I was afraid everything we're living would be an illusion." Clara looked at him with indescribable pain. "Don't you realize that by hiding the truth you made it precisely an illusion? You gave me a role in your theater, but never gave me the trust a true relationship deserves." Gabriel, who was listening from the door, approached confused. "Daddy, why is Clara crying?" The child extended his arms toward her, and Clara hugged him tightly, crying in silence. Alejandro felt the world crumbling under his feet. He wasn't only losing Clara's trust, but also the stability his son had found beside her. The discussion extended until late at night. Clara struggled between indignation and sadness. She had seen in Alejandro an upright man, willing to share life's daily struggles, and now found herself facing a millionaire who had hidden the truth from her. "I don't need riches, Alejandro," she finally said with a broken voice. "I only needed the truth, and you denied it to me." Her words resonated like a final judgment. Clara left the apartment with firm steps, while Gabriel called to her between sobs. Alejandro remained silent, with trembling hands and a torn heart. That night, he understood the price of his secret had been too high. He had wanted to protect his love, but had wounded it with lies, and now he could only wait to see if the faith, dignity, and love they had shared would be enough to heal what had been broken. The silence left after Clara's departure was more painful than any harsh word. The small apartment, which until recently had been filled with laughter and shared prayers, transformed into a hollow space where every corner reminded of her absence. Alejandro paced back and forth, with the weight of guilt crushing his chest, while Gabriel cried in his bed, calling for her as if he had lost a mother again. For days, Alejandro tried to approach, but Clara remained distant. She greeted him with courtesy on the street, but her eyes no longer sought his, and her gestures had become cold. The wound of the lie still bled, and each time she saw that magazine cover in her mind, she felt everything they had shared had been contaminated by deceit. It was then that Gabriel, unable to bear the emptiness, decided to confront his father. One night, through tears, he looked at him with seriousness improper for his age and said, "Daddy, why did you let her go? She was good. She loved me truly. I don't need a rich mommy or a pretty mommy. I just need Clara." The child's words pierced Alejandro like knives. He felt his son was showing him, with his innocence, the truth he hadn't known how to defend with his maturity. He hugged him tightly, and with a broken voice responded, I didn't let her go, son. I lost her out of fear. But I promise I'll fight for her, because you and I need her love, and because she's the woman God put in our path." The next day, Alejandro decided to shed all masks. He presented himself at Clara's humble house, not as millionaire nor as man disguised as poor, but as someone willing to confess his entire soul. He knocked on the door with trembling hands, and when she appeared with her apron still on and tired eyes, he lowered his head humbly. "Clara, I don't come to give you empty explanations. I come to ask your forgiveness. I hid my life because I was afraid you'd judge me for what I have and not for what I am. But in that fear I failed you, because I didn't trust your heart." She listened in silence, with crossed arms and wounded gaze. Alejandro continued, his voice breaking with each word. "I'm not worthy of asking anything from you, but I need you to know everything we lived was real. Every prayer, every simple meal, every smile of yours and my son's, none of that was theater. I found myself in your company and discovered the love money could never give me." Clara breathed deeply. Tears appeared in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Alejandro, it's not your money that hurts me. It's your lack of trust. I always showed you who I was, without disguises, without masks. Why couldn't you do the same with me?" He stepped forward with glassy eyes. "Because I never before met someone like you. I always had to doubt people's intentions, always thought I had to protect myself. But with you, I should have trusted from the first moment. And I was wrong." At that instant, a voice broke the tension. Gabriel had run after his father and, seeing Clara, threw himself into her arms. "Clara, don't leave. Don't leave me alone again. You're the mommy I asked for in my prayers," he said, sobbing. The child's cry disarmed Clara's last defenses. She hugged him tightly, finally letting her tears fall. She looked at Alejandro, and in her eyes reflected the internal battle between pain and love. The silence stretched for seconds that seemed eternal, until Clara spoke with a trembling voice. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now, Alejandro, but I can't stay away from Gabriel. His heart is too pure, and I don't want him to suffer for our mistakes." Those words were a spark of hope. It wasn't complete reconciliation, but it was a door left ajar. Alejandro understood that forgiveness would be a journey, not an instant, and that he had to travel it with patience, with actions, and not just promises. That night, returning together to the apartment, Clara sat again at the table with them. She didn't smile as before, but neither did she flee. Gabriel, happy, took her hands and began to pray with the same faith as always. "Thank you, Lord, because today Clara came back. Help us to be a real family." Alejandro closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, felt heaven was listening. The rumor arrived as storms always come to warm cities. First a murmur, then a wind that shakes curtains and doors, finally thunder that splits the sky in two. Within days, the neighborhood knew that the simple man in worn shirts was truly a millionaire who had chosen to hide his name behind a humble life. And as usually happens when truth comes to light, mixed with half-truths and twisted conjectures, no one spoke of what healed, but of what scandalizes. The maid took advantage of the widower, some said in breadlines. She surely smelled the money before anyone else. It was all planned, others added, puffing their chests with the certainty of those who never doubt. That's how they are. They climb wherever they can. Poor child, used as an excuse, concluded voices that had never spoken with Gabriel but felt authorized to pass judgment. Clara, who until recently walked through the neighborhood with serenity built over years of honest work, began noticing sharp looks that followed her like knives. They no longer greeted her with the same warmth. Some merchants' frank smiles became cautious gestures, and at the school where she cleaned hallways, 2 teachers stopped saying please and began giving instructions from a distance, as if contact made her dangerous. Alejandro wanted to put an immediate stop to it. His impulse was to take Clara's hand, put her in his most discreet car, and take her away from there, far from gossip, far from others' pettiness. But she, with that calm that had always disarmed him, gently refused. If I run, I confirm what they say. If I hide, I accept that my worth depends on their judgment. I know who I am before God. I'll stand my ground. And she stood. She kept sweeping at the same time, scrubbing the same floors, greeting with the same courtesy, patiently responding to those who now seemed to find flaws in every corner. That faithfulness to small things, that firmness in the everyday, began making even the most habitual gossips sound a bit less convinced of their own echo. However, the storm wasn't over. It was just gathering clouds for its major outbreak. The school administration, pressured by the wave of comments and some mothers concerned about the establishment's image, called an open meeting in the auditorium. They didn't call it a trial, but it was. A tribunal without robes, with plastic chairs and hands crossed over chests. Alejandro wanted to attend, but Clara asked him not to speak for her. If you explain, they'll say you do it because you can. If I speak, perhaps someone will understand that truth can't be bought. The hall was full. Some looks were frankly hostile, others simply curious. Clara entered with her head high, impeccable uniform, hair tied back with her favorite scarf. In her hands, she carried a small notebook, not to read a speech, but to remember, in case she trembled, the names of those who had treated her with respect in difficult days. A baker who gave credit without interest, a neighbor who left water on a hot afternoon, a teacher who confided her sadness in secret. She wanted that, if her voice broke, her heart would know she wasn't alone. Those who like to inaugurate condemnations spoke first. The institution must protect its reputation, said a mother sternly. We can't have someone involved in a scandal here. Scandal, Clara thought without saying it. Is falling in love with dignity a scandal when the man has money? A father, with crossed arms, became bolder. Everyone knows that when there's fortune, open hands appear. Then, something no one expected happened. Gabriel, sitting by the door, with his legs dangling from the chair, raised his hand as in class and without waiting permission spoke clearly. I asked God for a mommy. I asked for many nights, and he introduced her to me through Clara. She defended me when they laughed at my shoes, hugged me in storms, and taught me to pray without fear. If you think she's here for money, you don't know my prayer. The murmur broke like glass. Alejandro felt his throat close and silently thanked his son's courage. Clara breathed deeply, left the notebook aside, and finally stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud or trembling. It was barely firmer than a whisper, but so true it filled every corner of the hall. My name is Clara. I'm the daughter of a woman who broke her hands to get us ahead. I learned to clean floors before learning to write, and I'm not ashamed. My faith has sustained me when there was no bread, when lights were cut, when life wanted to bend my back. I met this child because danger crossed the street too fast, and I ran. Not for money, not for calculation, for humanity. Then came friendship, prayers, simple dinners, and yes, also true affection. She paused, and her clean gaze sought those who accused her. If you want to believe I came to steal something, I can't stop you. I can only tell you there's no gold greater than the peace of knowing who one is, and that peace isn't bought or inherited. It's earned every day, scrubbing floors with a calm soul. A different silence, less tense, settled over the assembly. One of the teachers, the same one who had begun giving instructions from afar, cleared her throat and lowered her eyes. The principal, accustomed to settling discussions with regulations, seemed to search in papers for an article justifying any decision, but didn't find it. Finally, she said, with measured formality, that there were no work infractions, that the institution valued Clara's trajectory, and that no sanctions would proceed. However, Social judgment doesn't end with an announcement. Like every storm, it leaves puddles where shadows reflect. At the exit, a small group continued whispering. Then Alejandro, who had remained on the sidelines as he promised Clara, approached with serene steps. He brought no escorts or suits, only his empty hands and the eyes of one who knows he's in debt. "I didn't come to defend her," he said, looking at those still holding the knife of suspicion. "I came to confess I was wrong to hide who I was. I ask your forgiveness for using this neighborhood as a hideout, but no one has the right to point at her. I was the one who was afraid, not her. I lied from fear of being loved for my money. She upheld the truth of her life without hesitation. If you need to judge someone, judge me." And as if the child had received a signal that only pure hearts recognize, Gabriel took Clara's hand, raised it before everyone, and said with the same conviction used to ask for miracles, "This is my mommy." The child's words brought no document or certificate, but had the legitimacy of the sacred. There was timid applause, then another, then several, until the entire hall sounded like living wood. Not everyone applauded, of course. There are always corners of ice where mercy takes time to melt. Even so, something had changed. The following days were a test of silent resistance. The weighing looks continued, but helping hands also appeared. The neighbor from the second floor left a bag with sweet bread at Clara's door. The baker, the one who had given her credit expecting nothing, smiled at her with complicity. The teacher who had avoided her approached and, with honest awkwardness, asked forgiveness. Dignity, when not displayed but lived, ends up making its own way in others' consciousness. Alejandro, for his part, chose a gesture that didn't fit in headlines. Instead of announcing grandiose donations, he began hiring anonymously neighborhood fathers for small maintenance works at the school and surrounding houses, paying fair wages and not photographing himself with anyone. When someone discovered him, he smiled and repeated, "I'm not paying guilt, I'm learning to belong." One afternoon in the plaza where their first complicity was born, Clara and Alejandro sat with Gabriel between them. A warm wind blew, and the sky seemed to hang very close, as if listening. Clara spoke again, this time for one alone, but with words the whole world needed to hear. "I don't care about your suits or your accounts. I care that you know how to tell the truth and uphold it when it hurts. I care that you protect this child's innocence and don't turn love into a showcase. If you really want to walk with me, let it be with the bare feet of humility." Alejandro nodded with emotion that clouded his vision. He didn't promise castles or perpetual pacts. He promised, with the simplicity of one who finally understands, to be present and tell the truth. Gabriel, oblivious to adult solemnity, leaned over both their knees and whispered a prayer as brief as it was immense. "Thank you, Lord, because love isn't scared of people who judge." Man, the judgment, which hadn't been judgment but mirror, finished dissolving in the air. Not because everyone changed, but because the family being born chose not to live tied to others' opinions. Sometimes redemption doesn't come with fireworks, but with the constancy of three interlaced hands that decide to advance step by step, with patience, with truth, with faith. As night fell, the neighborhood returned to its noises. Pots clanging, laughter on the sidewalk, old radios playing ballads. Clara closed her house door and, before turning off the light, looked out the window. On the corner, Alejandro and Gabriel waited with a bag of oranges. He looked up. She smiled. There were no speeches or solemn promises, just a simple gesture, the same as every day, that now carried new meaning. Belonging without asking permission, loving without asking forgiveness, living without disguises. The storm had passed, not the sky, the storm. The sky remained there, clean, busy lighting the first star. The following months were like a new season in the lives of Alejandro, Clara, and Gabriel. There wasn't sudden change or magic that erased wounds overnight. What occurred was something deeper, a transformation process that, like all true redemption, was built with patience, humility, and small acts that gradually drew a new destiny. Alejandro began showing himself as what he really was, not a hidden millionaire nor a disguised poor man, but a man willing to learn from simple life. He stopped living with the obsession of pretending and started investing his time in what he had neglected before: the details that sustain a family. He learned to prepare modest breakfasts, to take Gabriel to school by hand, to listen unhurriedly to stories the child invented and prayers Clara shared each night. He discovered that in those gestures, which the world would consider insignificant, lay the wealth he had sought all his life. Clara, for her part, also lived her own process. Although the pain of the initial lie remained a scar, she chose not to let that wound define her present. Gradually, she returned to smiling as at the beginning, to looking at Alejandro without the weight of distrust, and to accepting that life was giving her a second chance to love. She didn't do it from naivety or empty romanticism, but from conviction. She understood that true love isn't absence of errors, but the capacity to forgive and rebuild upon them. Gabriel flourished like never before. His eyes shone with new light, that of a child who felt his prayers had been heard. He no longer cried for lack of a mother, because in Clara he had found that embrace he had asked heaven for so much. And although society still murmured in some corners, he didn't care. In his heart, Clara was his mommy, and Alejandro had returned to being the joyful and present father he had always dreamed of. A special day marked a before and after. Alejandro's decision to open his house, the mansion that had remained closed since Isabella's death, to begin a new life there, but without the excesses that had turned it into a mausoleum of memories. He invited Clara and Gabriel to enter together for the first time. Lights turned on, halls resonated with steps that were no longer of solitude, and the mansion stopped being a symbol of empty opulence to transform into a family's home. Clara wasn't impressed by marble columns or valuable paintings. She walked with serenity, conscious that her worth didn't depend on those walls. When Gabriel ran through corridors with echoing laughter, she followed him with the same naturalness she would have shown in any humble yard. Alejandro observed the scene with moist eyes. He understood his house had finally filled with life, not because of luxury that had always been there, but because of the presence of two hearts that gave it meaning. The humble neighborhood wasn't left behind either. Alejandro decided to invest part of his fortune in improving conditions of the place that had transformed him. He didn't do it with grandiose announcements or public speeches, but with concrete works: paved streets, scholarships for school children, dignified jobs for family fathers. Clara was his inspiration and guide in each decision, always reminding him that dignity isn't given as a gift, it's respected. Alejandro's transformation also became evident in his way of speaking. He no longer boasted of his business achievements or travels, but proudly shared simple learnings: how to prepare bread with Gabriel's hands, how to plant flowers in the garden with Clara, how to pray before sleep with sincere gratitude. He discovered these were his life's true victories. The most emotional day came in a small, intimate ceremony where Alejandro, with tears in his eyes, asked Clara to stay by his side, not as employee, not as guest, but as wife and mother of his son. There were no sumptuous dresses or banquets for hundreds of guests. There was a simple chapel, an altar adorned with flowers picked by Gabriel, and reverent silence broken by the child's words. "Thank you, Lord, because now I really have a complete family." The applause was small, but the entire sky seemed to join in that instant. Alejandro and Clara looked at each other with certainty that the impossible had become reality. A millionaire who had pretended to be poor found, in a humble woman with working hands, the greatest love of his life. Redemption wasn't in money, nor in disguise, nor even in immediate forgiveness. It was in the path traveled, in trials faced, in tears shed, and in faith that sustained them when everything seemed lost. It was there they understood that life's true value isn't measured in accumulated riches, but in hearts that choose and care for each other mutually. That night, back in their renewed home, Alejandro took Clara's hand and Gabriel's, and together they watched the starry sky from the balcony. The gentle wind seemed to whisper a promise, that of a future built on truth, dignity, and true love. The story of Alejandro, Clara, and Gabriel wasn't a fairy tale woven with threads of perfection, but a real path full of falls, tears, doubts, and painful silences. And precisely because of that, it was a true story, one of those that leaves marks on the soul of whoever hears it, because what transforms isn't the perfect, but the imperfect redeemed by love and faith. Alejandro, who had believed for years that wealth was a wall against solitude, discovered that wall had left him isolated from the real world. His millions couldn't bring Isabella back, nor give Gabriel the mother he needed, nor fill the void that consumed him each night. Only when he renounced the disguise of power and dared to live in the vulnerability of simplicity could he open his heart to what really matters. The dignity of a woman who didn't sell herself to money, and the sincere love of a son who only asked for hugs and company. Clara, for her part, demonstrated that worth isn't measured in bills or surnames, but in the faithfulness of one who remains firm, even when the whole world points. Her strength wasn't born from self-help books or motivational speeches, but from faith forged in the silence of difficult nights and certainty that God sustains those who walk with honesty. Her life was testimony that the deepest cleanliness isn't that of shining floors, but that of the heart that refuses to be stained with resentment or self-interest. And Gabriel, the child who dreamed of a mother, became the purest voice of the entire story. His innocent prayer was the engine that moved heaven and attracted the answer that seemed impossible. Through him, we understand that simple faith of a childlike heart can tear down walls that money and logic could never cross. Today, contemplating the new family born from the improbable union between a widowed millionaire, a humble woman, and a child who never stopped believing, it's impossible not to wonder, how many times do we search in wrong places for what can only be found in the essential? How many times do we disguise our wounds with masks of success, when all we need is the sincere embrace of someone who loves us as we are? The true redemption of this story wasn't in Alejandro revealing his fortune or Clara accepting his truth. It was in both their decision to build a home where trust and faith were foundations, and in the miracle of a child who refused to stop waiting. In the final scene, the imaginary camera shows us a dining room illuminated by warm light from a simple lamp. On the table, there are no banquets, but steaming stew, freshly broken bread, and laughter filling the air. Alejandro takes Clara's hand, Gabriel imitates them, and before beginning, they bow their heads in prayer. Outside, the city buzzes with its endless noise, but inside that home reigns peace the world cannot give or take away. And in that peace, a truth is heard that pierces the heart. True love doesn't seek appearances, dignity doesn't depend on others' looks, and faith converts the impossible into destiny. If this story moved your heart, subscribe now, share this video, and join us for more stories full of emotion, faith, and hope. Hit the bell and become part of this community that believes in the power of stories that transform lives.